All right, we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 4. So this is the story, well-known story of Cain and Abel. And I think the point of this chapter is to give not only details about the family of Adam and Eve, but to highlight the consequences of the fall. So now that Adam has sinned and the earth is under the curse, things are going to quickly spiral out of control. So through the line of Cain, we're going to see this next week when we cover chapters 5 and probably 6 together. There's going to be two lines, right? The line of Cain and then this new line of Seth. And the line of Cain is very wicked. So mankind is going to increase in wickedness as time goes on. But then there's this other godly line from Seth. It would have been from Abel, but obviously Cain kills Abel. So this chapter is broken down into three parts, at least in the New King James Version. So I'll cover it in three parts. Verses 1 through 15 is titled Cain Murders Abel. Verses 16 through 24 is the family of Cain. And then verses 25 and 26, this is labeled a new son. And of course, the new son is Seth. So let's go through the verses 1 and 2. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So this shows us, I think, that a lot of time can pass between just one verse. From verses 1 to 2, you're jumping from the time the kids were born to they're an adult. I don't know if you've ever read through the Gospels, but it'll talk about Jesus was here, he did this, and then he went here and did that. It makes it sound like it's the same day or the next day. But sometimes between verses in the Bible, weeks can pass, months, years, even decades. So between one or two verses, you can jump ahead 10, 20, 30, 40 years perhaps. So they're adults now. We don't get anything about their upbringing. And Adam and Eve clearly are having more children than just two. I think this is a mistake that some people make. They think, Adam and Eve had two kids and then a third. Well, they could have had 30 children for all we know. The fact that Cain then moves away and there's this whole group of people living east of Eden in the land of Nod, what does that tell you? Well, Adam and Eve had daughters at some point and people reproduced, and who knows how long that took, but mankind is rapidly growing in number. And they all came from Adam and Eve, so that'll come in later when we get into that question, who did Cain marry? That's sort of that age-old question kids ask their Sunday school teacher. Where did Cain get his wife? And you probably know the answer by now, but we'll get to that later. So they obviously had many other children, but just to focus on kind of two lines, the godly line, the wicked line, they're focusing on these two sons and later the one who replaces Abel. Okay, so it says that now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she bore Cain. So when it says that Adam knew his wife, this is clearly a euphemism for you-know-what, right? In the Bible, the word or phrase to know speaks of a relationship. So this is an intimate relationship. But later on, remember when Jesus says, depart from me, those who come to him saying, Lord, Lord, haven't I done this in your name? And he says, depart from me, I never knew you. What is he saying? I did not have a personal relationship with you. So we use the term to know as in, I know of this person or I met them once. But in the Bible, the term to know speaks of a relationship. So that's important when studying the Bible going forward. So Adam knew his wife, and she conceived, and it says she bore Cain. And she says, her response is, I have acquired a man from the Lord. So what does that tell us? Well, children are a gift from God. And even though this is a natural thing, it's a natural process, this is still God giving life. So anytime a woman has a child, it is God giving them that life. God is always the giver of life. And we know from other Bible stories, God can open the womb and close the womb. So whenever a child is born, this is a gift from God. And they're obeying the commandment to be fruitful and multiply. So this is just two that are mentioned, but we don't know that Cain is actually officially the firstborn. It's just these are the people that matter for this story. Any questions on that, Ray?
Have they also been girls born before?
Yeah, in theory, Adam and Eve, they could have had 10 daughters before Cain was even born. I mean, probably not, but who knows? They definitely had other children. So Cain was born first, in the fact that, just the way it's written, it's very possible these two are twins. We don't know that for sure, but just the way it's written, it doesn't say that so much time had passed, so they could have been twins. It says, now Abel was a keeper of the sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So one is a farmer, the other is a shepherd. And that matters because of what's written next. And this is the thing that we're going to spend some time on. This is Cain and Abel and how they worshiped God. So this is how people worshiped originally. So look at verse 3. It says, in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Now, why did Cain bring the fruit of the ground?
Because he produced it himself.
Yeah, this is his occupation. That's what he had. So that would seem reasonable to some people, but verse 4, Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock. Well, he's a shepherd. He brought a lamb or some sort of animal. And the Lord, and this is the thing we need to focus on, the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. And then it says, Cain was very angry and his countenance fell. So these two men are worshiping God. This is how they worship God, by offering sacrifices. There was no church, right? There's no tabernacle. There's nothing like that, no priesthood. This is a very primitive way to worship God, or the original way. Now, the question really becomes, why did God accept his offering and not Cain's? Marcus.
Because without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sin.
Okay.
And we studied in chapter 1 that the plants were created on one day, and it was the next day that the animals were created. And then, of course, eventually man was created. So we're moving up the scale of, let's say, value or worth in God's eyes, but really, because animals have blood,
Okay.
I think is the real.
Okay, so you say it's a matter of God demands a blood sacrifice. That's why Abel's was accepted and Cain's was rejected. Does everyone agree with that, or have you heard that before?
That's a theory.
It's a theory, okay, because it doesn't actually...
That's my theory.
Does it tell us why it was rejected? No. All right. But let's back up a little bit. Let's just focus on worship for a moment. This proves one thing, at least one thing, that God does not accept all forms of worship. Because Cain is worshiping God, he offers God, it may have been his best vegetables, but does God accept the offering? No, he doesn't. So we can say that God doesn't accept all forms of worship. Now, this is a very politically incorrect thing to say, that God only accepts certain types of worship, but it's absolutely true based on this and a lot of other passages. Larry.
Well, I think based on what's coming in the next few verses, because God did say in verse 7, well, if you do well, won't you be accepted?
Mm-hmm.
And so God, it sounds like God would have accepted his sacrifice, but his attitude was off.
Okay.
They had wrong motives behind it all.
So that's another possibility, that it wasn't really what they offered, it's the condition of their heart while they're offering it. That's another possibility. But so for worship to be accepted, we can say this: it has to be done the right way. It has to be done God's way. Jesus said in John 4:24, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. So let's get into it. Why was Cain's worship rejected and Abel's accepted? There's two main viewpoints. First, again, we have to acknowledge the Bible doesn't specifically tell us, but the first theory is that the offering, it was just understood. Maybe God told them, maybe it was based on the offering from chapter 3 where God kills the animal and clothes them with the skins, that it was just understood it has to be a blood sacrifice, which would point ahead not only to the Old Testament sacrificial system, but ultimately it points to the cross. So that's one viewpoint. I tend to hold that view, but the other interpretation would be that, listen, Cain is a farmer, and this is all he had to offer. And Abel offered the animal because he was the shepherd. So it's not really what they offered, it's the condition of their heart. So Cain, for whatever reason, maybe he held the best vegetables back for himself, and he gave God the leftovers. He gave God stuff that had started to rot. I mean, that's possible. So we're not exactly sure, but to me, the thing that makes the most sense is that Cain understood he should have been offering an animal. He should have been offering blood. He could have probably traded with Abel. He could have found an animal if he really wanted to. And if that's true, his heart wasn't right, because if he knew God says, hey, it needs to be blood, and he offers something that's not blood, he's willfully disobeying. So either way, I think his heart isn't in the right place. But those are the two viewpoints. So when it comes to worship, one thing you can't avoid... Okay, go ahead.
Well, whatever, if you're going to give a sacrifice, it should be a sacrifice. Well, what did God give? He gave his son. He gave the very, very best that he had. And like you said, my guess is that that Cain brought, and what's, if you bring, all right, so you bring an ear of corn, so what? I mean, there's 100 kernels on that ear of corn, and they'll keep reproducing.
Yeah.
My guess is that Abel brought the very best of his flock, the very best, the one without blemish, and just, with the foreshadowing that is the kind of sacrifice that is going to take for the remission of sin. It's got to be the very best you got. We sing that hymn, give of the best to your master.
Yep.
That's my guess.
All right. So like I was saying, one thing you can't avoid when reading the Old Testament, when the worship of God is spoken about, the Lord is very particular, we could say that. So let's turn to Leviticus 10 for a moment. If worship, this is especially true in Leviticus when God lays out the priesthood and how the sacrifices are to be given. Yeah, it has to be done exactly the way God says. And we read this account with these two men, Nadab and Abihu. When they offer strange fire, they give this offering that isn't the way God prescribed. What happens? Well, God strikes them dead because they did something different from what God prescribed. Look at Leviticus 10:1. It says, Then Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it. Everyone got it? Yeah. Okay. Then Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it, put incense on it, and offered profane or strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. So you see, they're kind of going rogue and doing their own thing. So fire, what happened? Fire went out from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. And Moses said to Aaron, This is what the Lord spoke, saying, By those who come near me, I must be regarded as holy. And before all the people, I must be glorified. So we see that God takes worship very, very seriously. So Cain offering the wrong sacrifice, this is a very, very serious issue. And in the Old Testament, when the priests did things the wrong way, I remember with the Ark of the Covenant, no one was supposed to touch it. And who was the man that, remember, it was being transported on the ox cart, and it started to, who is the man who put out his hand to steady?
Uziel.
What?
Uziel?
Okay.
Is that right?
Well, I was asking you.
No.
But he touched the ark, and God killed him, right? Now, how does this apply to the New Testament? Does God still care about worship today? Do we have to worship God the way he Now, clearly, worship today looks very different than it did back then. We're not offering sacrifices because the once for all sacrifice has been made. So there's no more special priesthood. There's no more sacrifices per se, or literal sacrifices. But still, we have New Testament instruction how to worship God. In the New Testament, in the epistles, there's preaching in the church, there's prayer, there's preaching and teaching, there's the Lord's Supper, right? They sang a hymn. Jesus and his disciples sung a hymn. The church took up offerings. They baptized people. So we do have instructions in the New Testament of what is to happen in the church. So we can't just, the point is, we can't just say, hey, I'm sincere, so as long as I'm sincere, anything I do is okay. That's not the way it works. Remember, it has to be in spirit. It does need to be sincere, but it also needs to be according to truth. So we need to do things God's way. All right, I saw a few hands. Ray?
Revelations, the churches that don't meet up to the standards?
Right, yeah, you got some pretty serious warnings with the churches, 7 churches in Revelation. Janet, did you have a hand up at some point? Okay.
I just wanted the scripture that.
Oh, that was Leviticus 10. Yeah, 1 through 3. Marcus?
I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice,
Right.
holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Romans 12:1.
And we offer the sacrifice of praise, which is the fruit of our lips. But there's no more animal sacrifice or offering things or creatures. All right, let's go back to Genesis.
Yeah, but when you're a soldier, or a policeman, or a fireman, or others, you're offering your bodies a living sacrifice.
Sure. All right, so bottom line, Cain's worship, he did something wrong. Verse 6, so because of that, the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? This is after it was rejected. If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. So God knows that Cain is now sort of at a crossroads. Something has happened, and now he's in danger of maybe harboring resentment. He's done something wrong. Is he going to confess it and move on and do the right thing? Or is he going to continue down this road of doing things wrong? Well, we know what he did, right? He didn't confess it or repent. He continued to do the wrong thing. And we don't know how much time had passed. Maybe he's dwelling on it. Maybe some other things happened. We know in the end, Cain is so angry, he decides he's going to rise up and kill his brother. So we read this in verse 8. Now Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Now, it sounds like it's just the two of them out in the field, and maybe Cain thinks, nobody's here. I can just kill him and get away with it. So it looks like Cain, he kills his brother, maybe buries the body, and he thinks, well, nobody saw me. Well, of course, there's no such thing as secret sin because there's always an audience of at least one. There's always one other witness. Now, why did Cain kill Abel? This is another question we have to kind of wrestle with. Why did he do it? Did Abel do anything wrong to Cain? Did Cain have any reason? I mean, maybe there's something that we're not told, but
Maybe
Yep.
jealousy.
I think it was jealousy.
jealousy. Okay.
I think he was angry with God.
He's okay, so and it doesn't have to be either or. He's jealous of Abel and he's angry with God. I think both are good answers. Any other ideas? Okay. But Abel doesn't seem to do anything wrong. So I do think both are probably true. Cain's anger really, I think, is directed at God. But because God's the one who rejected the offering. So, yeah, he can be jealous, but the anger is really at God. Here's the thing, though. You can't do anything to God. If you're angry at God, what can you do to God? You can't do anything. So Cain does the next closest thing. He can't kill God, so instead he kills the man of God, right? And this is maybe an early form of Christian persecution, you could say, where the wicked persecutes the righteous just because they're a godly person. Because we hate God so much, we're going to take it out on the person who loves God and is loved by God. And that still happens today. So to me, that's what's happening here. And it's really a fulfillment of what the Lord said would happen back in chapter 3. Remember how there would be enmity or hostility between the seed of the serpent, the devil's people, and the seed of the woman, Christ, and his people. So this is exactly what happened then, and it continues on to this day. The wicked will persecute the righteous simply because, well, we are made in God's image. I mean, I think that's why the devil went after Adam and Eve to begin with, because they're made in the image of God. The devil can't get to God, so he goes after the ones made in his image, and Cain can't get to God, so he kills the man of God. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. And besides that, 1 John, you don't have to turn there and just make a note. 1 John 3:12, the Apostle John writes that Cain was of the wicked one. So it's not like Cain was a good guy and he just had one hiccup or something. Now, Cain, John says, was of the wicked one and that he murdered his brother. Why did he murder him, John asks? Because his works were evil and his brother's righteous. So again, that might speak of the jealousy. So another way you could look at this is, again, the first form of Christian persecution. So, verse 9, the Lord says to Cain, after this happens, and again, it sort of sounds like God is present in visible form, or because they're talking to God. They actually seem to hear God's audible voice, and then it says that Cain is going to depart from God's presence. So we don't know if God is physically present in like the pre-incarnate Christ. That's the impression I keep getting. I don't know if that's the case. But either way, verse 9, God somehow, he sees this and he says to Cain, where is your brother Abel? And we know he's not asking because he doesn't know. He's going through this process again to see if what? If Cain will confess, just like last time when he said, Adam and Eve, where are you? And what have you done? God knows the answers to the questions, but he's giving them a chance to confess. Does Cain confess?
No.
Nope. So the Lord asked Cain, where is your brother Abel? And he says, I do not know. So he lies. And then he gives this sarcastic response to God. What, am I my brother's keeper? So this seems to be a play on words because Abel was a keeper of the sheep. So he's lying to God and he's sort of back-talking God or just speaking disrespectfully at the very least. So verse 10, the Lord said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. So God clearly knows what happened, and it's as if Abel's blood cries out in the sense that Cain, it's crying out for justice. Like Cain really deserves punishment here. So remember, there's no government, there's no law, there's no nothing. So who's going to punish Cain? I mean, if God doesn't punish Cain, the only other option is, word could get around and there could be vigilante justice, I suppose. And that's what Cain's afraid of. So the Lord says in verse 11, "So now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. A fugitive and a vagabond you shall be on the earth." So the ground is already cursed back from what Adam did. But now it's like there's a curse upon Cain. It's like God's telling him, things are going to be working against you now for the rest of your life, which kind of makes, it should cause us to be afraid. And I've talked about this before, how I do think some sins are more serious than others. Now, you can commit very serious sin and you cross a line to where now, things are just not going to go your way from here on out, no matter what. I don't know if that still happens today or not. I think it probably does, but it certainly happens with Cain. So now, things are not going to go your way. The ground is not going to produce for you. And we read in verse 13, "And Cain said to the Lord, 'Oh, my punishment is greater than I can bear.'" As this was playing, I'm thinking, I don't feel sorry for him at all. That's what I was thinking. Do you feel sorry for him? When I was hearing that, I'm like, yeah, you deserve this, right? Verse 14, "Surely," he says to God, "you have driven me out this day from the face of the ground. I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond. And it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me." Now let me ask you, does Cain deserve that? If somebody killed Cain, does he deserve it? I mean, you reap what you sow, I suppose. But still, God does not approve of vigilante justice. If somebody came along and killed Cain, would that be justified? Well, you can sort of rationalize it in your mind, but that would still be wrong, okay? There has been no government set up. So God actually shows grace to Cain. And maybe I shouldn't say this, but I'm not going to say it. Because I was going to say, if I were God, but that's never a good thing to say. But God shows grace, and he does something to make sure Cain is protected. Verse 15, "And the Lord said to him, 'Therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark on Cain, lest anyone finding him should kill him.'" So essentially, this amounts to a mark of protection. So whatever God did, some think it was like a branding or some sort of like tattoo type of branding on his forehead or something. I don't know if that's it. Nobody knows. But it's understood now that Cain is a marked man, as in he's protected, that if anyone kills Cain, like he doesn't have God's blessing, but he has protection on him. Now, who has heard about the mark of Cain? There's a few different theories out there of what the mark was. Is anyone familiar with any of these theories? No? All right, well, it's like the other thing. The Bible doesn't tell us. Why was Cain's sacrifice rejected? The Bible just doesn't say. We did speculate a little bit, and I don't want to speculate about the mark of Cain. Some people have used this to justify racism. This is a pretty well-known teaching that I don't know if it was in churches in the South, but a lot of people did teach. If you look it up on the internet, there's a belief that the mark of Cain was dark skin. And the Mormons have a teaching similar to that. That is not, the Bible doesn't say that anywhere. So that is kind of maybe a more repulsive thing that people have created to sort of justify their racism. But there's no indication of what the mark is, except that Cain now has this protection upon his life. So Cain is now going to be a wanderer. We read in verse 16, so this is going into the next section, the family of Cain. So it says, "Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord." Any theories on what that means? Does that mean God was present in one place? That's the way it sounds. Any Anyone study Bible give a note or anything about the presence? Okay, I didn't really find much on that either. Either way, they're talking, so now Cain goes in the other direction. So he's going east of Eden, and we know he ended up in the land of Nod. Again, something we know nothing about, don't know anything about where it was. It was east of Eden, but we don't know where Eden was. Doesn't really matter. Verse 17, we get this interesting comment. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived. And of course, this is where, who has been a Sunday school teacher and actually had a kid ask this? Has anyone actually encountered that? Had a child ask, where did Cain get his wife from? You've wondered. It's one of those questions that's pretty popular. And who knows the answer? Where did Cain get his wife?
Must have been his sister.
Okay. Cain, yeah.
Maybe it was his aunt.
Either way, it doesn't make it much better, I guess. Now, why is this even a question or a controversy? Because people misread the Bible and they just make assumptions that Adam and Eve have two children. Because only two are mentioned, so Cain and Abel, where did he get his wife? There are no other people on earth. It's just Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. Now Abel's gone, so there's only three people on earth. Well, the Bible never says that. Again, you're assuming that, or some people are. So obviously, Adam and Eve had other children. So the answer, where did Cain get his wife? People say, well, obviously, he married his sister. Which, little kids would be like, ooh, that's gross,
Could have been his second cousin, three times removed.
Right. But you understand, it doesn't actually have to be his sister. Because Adam and Eve, at some point, brother and sister must have been married. But there could have been reproduction. This could be a distant cousin. Okay, it's possible. But obviously, it's a family member traced back to Adam and Eve. Okay, so they have children. Their children have children. And then they build a city. So verse 17, Cain knew his wife. She conceived and bore Enoch. And this is a different Enoch than what comes later. And he built a city and called the name of the city after his son, Enoch. Okay. And then it lists grandchildren, and then their children all the way down to this man, Lamech. So what do we learn about Lamech? Lamech was, maybe we could say, the first polygamist, or maybe bigamy is the better term, but he has more than one wife. And this kind of speaks to, okay, the line of Cain, it started out with a murderer, and now you have this, and it just shows how mankind is kind of getting worse and worse. And also Lamech is going to kind of brag about how he killed somebody. He's going to kill more people maybe. So mankind, again, things are kind of spiraling out of control. So Lamech is violent. It mentions a few other people in verse 21. It mentions the craftsmen who fashioned bronze and iron, verse 22, it mentions also verses 21 and 22 mention people who created music or played the flute. So mankind is advancing in knowledge. And a few other people have had different ideas, and I just want to debunk this just in case anybody has been taught this. I told this story before when I was the Sunday school director years ago. There were books in the library about creation and Adam and Eve, and it addressed this question of Cain's wife, and it basically said that, I don't know if he married like a Neanderthal, but it said that basically mankind was evolving throughout history. The theory of evolution, this Yale Divinity School, this book from Yale, said that evolution is true, and what happened was God breathed the breath of life into Adam, and Adam became human, but then there were all these other, humanoid type of creatures living in the land of Nod, and that's who Cain married. Has anyone ever heard this before? Yeah, I mean, it's surprising how many people believe that Adam and Eve and their story is kind of running parallel to evolution, and at some point God steps in and takes an evolved, ape or something and turns them into Adam. If you ever run into that, you know that's a ministry you don't. If they're that far off in Genesis, it's just going to be downhill from there on out. So just to let you know, that is out there. Ray, you had a hand up? Okay. But that's the thing, if this is why going through Genesis is so important. If you don't get the age of the earth right and Adam and Eve right and evolution right, if you don't get these things right, you're going to be way off with biblical interpretation from here on out. One comment about Cain's wife, and you say, well, isn't that against God's law? Like to have him marry a relative? That did become sinful around the time of Moses. So when God gave the law to Moses, it became an abomination for any close relatives to come together. But early on, there were no other options. We say it was a different time. People speculate, the gene pool or the blood, they say, was more pure, so you wouldn't have normal genetic defects that you would have today. Obviously, we think of this totally different now. So it was a different time. They had no other options. Marcus, you had something? No? Okay. All right, back to Genesis 4. So God's law had not been given. That's what's happening there. There are these two lines. So the godly line has now been snuffed out. So Abel is gone. And now really you only have evil men on the earth. I mean, maybe Adam is the man of God, but there's really no other godly people around the way it looks. So we get to verse 23. Lamech mentions him. So great grandson of Cain. He says to his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice, wives of Lamech, listen to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me, even a young man for hurting me. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 70-fold. Now here's the problem. God is the one who put the mark on Cain to protect him. God had the right to say that. Does Lamech have the right to say he will be avenged 70-fold? I mean, it really speaks to his character, and by the time you get to the days of Noah, mankind is very, very violent. So violent, so wicked, we know God had to start over and flood the earth. Mankind was so wicked. So it all kind of traces back to Cain. Cain, the devil is what? A murderer, right? From the beginning, he was called a murderer. And Cain, in a sense, is a child of Satan. That's what the Apostle John says. He was of the evil one. So that's why it's important when, we raise children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. If kids are being raised by ungodly people, then just society is just going to become more and more ungodly. And that's why it's important to have that other line. But as of now, there's no line because it's just Cain and his descendants. Marcus.
What about Seth's descendants?
Yeah, well, but that's the way it is up until now. So things are going to change now because Seth is going to be born. So there wouldn't be hope except for Seth. And I think this is part of Satan's plan to so corrupt mankind, to make man so evil, because this is the prophecy to bring the Messiah into the world. The Messiah is going to be the seed of the woman, but if Satan can so corrupt mankind, he thinks he can prevent, I think, the devil thinks he can prevent the Messiah from coming into the world. So God now gives this other child. So verse 25 says, and Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth. For God has appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed. So in conclusion, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 3, we see that Seth is listed in the genealogy of who? Christ. So next week we'll probably cover chapters 5 and 6, where Seth and his descendants are called sons of God. So going into the next chapter, again, two lines. There's the line of Cain, which is very wicked, and then you will have this other line, the righteous line of Seth, who are called the children of God. What does it take to become a child of God? Well, we see in verse 26, it says, "And as for Seth, to him also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. Then men began to call on the name of the Lord."